Okay. Welcome everyone to this virtual discussion. I'm Özge Genç. I'm a visiting fellow at for Conflict and Security Program at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. This webinar is the first in a series of events on Syria that Middle East Council will be organizing in the coming months. This highlights our commitment to fostering meaningful dialogue for key regional challenges, conflicts, and post-conflict situations. This webinar is being recorded and we are currently live on YouTube. For Arabic speakers, there's Arabic translation, and for that, please click on the world icon or the translation. I'm sure in the chat you will find some more directions. I'm so glad you have joined us to discuss one of the most significant and complex transitions in the modern history of the Middle East. Today we are discussing the new Syria, opportunities, risks, regional implications in post-Assad era. Syria is at a very critical turning point. As we all know, the determination and endurance and resilience of its people, alongside the leadership of key opposition actors, is driving the country's future. Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham, led by Ahmad al-Sharaa, has become a central player in forming transitional governance with plans to dissolve its military wing, bring armed factions into a unified national army, and prepare the country for elections, for state building, elections, and constitutional reform. Promises have been made for broader participation and shared responsibility, all of which will be crucial for creating a stable and inclusive state framework. A national dialogue conference is planned in a month's time. I think it's a critical opportunity, but it also highlights the delicate balance of representation that Syrian leaders must strike. Just towards the end of the year, we witnessed the collapse of a regime that many thought was immovable, unshakable. It was a revolution. It was an extraordinary act of defiance, bringing down a decades-old dictatorship and intelligence-driven state in just 12 days. Today, the new leadership is trying to push to move quickly on reforms, to build trust with the Syrians, and to gain international support and trust. There are, of course, contradictions. Some elements are acting against the stated goals of embracing societal diversity, and limited engagement with certain political forces adds to and may add to the fragility of this phase. However, as history shown, transitional periods inherently carry risks and potential failures. So perhaps we need to first acknowledge the progress that has been made and then assess it in comparison to other transitions in the region and in the world. So today we will unpack these complexities and explore how Syria's leaders can navigate these challenges to steer the country towards development, stability, and inclusivity. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers, starting with Hei'at. Hei'at is a Syrian columnist and a consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program of the Chatham House. We have Marwan Kabalan, a Syrian academic and writer. Marwan is the director of policy analysis at this Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies here in Doha, Qatar. We have Arwa Demon, founder of INARA, International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance, and Scrappy Goat Media. She's a leading voice in humanitarian advocacy for Syria's children and families. She's a Syrian American who grew up in Morocco and Turkey. INARA recently launched its office in Damascus to provide medical and mental support, and maybe beyond. We can hear from Arwa. We have Hafsa Halawa, who is an independent consultant working on political, social, and economic affairs and development goals across the Middle East and Horn of Africa regions. She's also an expert on Syria and engaged in several dialogue and track two processes. So let's get started. We have 2 rounds of 5 minutes for each speaker. And in the last 15 minutes, we have a rapid fire Q&A session where questions of the audience will take the center stage. And for the audience, please write your questions in the Q&A if you haven't submitted your questions yet. Let's begin by setting the stage with Hei'at. Hei'at's expertise on Syria's armed groups and the evolving governance dynamics that he has been talking and writing about in the last 1.5 months, I could say. And of course, before that, offer us a crucial lens to understand the multi-layered realities on the ground. So Hei'at, in Syria, HTS stands as a controversial and powerful force, one that has transformed from a militant actor, a rebel force, into a political entity of interest. And with great influence comes great complexity. Additionally, there are other military and political actors inside Syria and opposition actors and figures in the diaspora. And their inclusion, their participation in the system is a critical question. And the landscape is incredibly diverse. So I would like to start by asking you, how do you see this multi-layered actor map, including the current military and political actors influencing the new Syria's transition trajectory? If you could help us navigate this map of actors, their geographical and social influence, the interplay between different actors and their relations with neighboring countries or proxies, we would be glad. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a big question to cover in 5 minutes. I'll do my best, but I think in general, you have, before starting talking about the different groups, you mentioned the 11 days offensive that basically led to the collapse of the regime. I think it will be important to highlight that the fight against Assad did not start with that. And the collapse of the regime was not only the result of those 11 days. And this is important to reflect here because of what I will be saying later on, because you have different groups, whether those are political or armed groups, who have, including also civil society groups, but I'm not going to talk about the civil society groups at this bit. We'll talk about them later on, who contributed, have been fighting against the regime for many years, since at least 2011. So keeping that in mind and trying to see how their different interests could be sort of accommodated will be essential for stabilizing Syria for the many years to come. Now, when we talk about the armed groups, everyone's talking about HTS right now, but you have, as you mentioned, many armed groups who are still active and who are still armed in different parts of Syria. The biggest one is in northeast Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And unlike the rest of the groups I'll be talking about later on, this entity and those forces are still in active sort of fighting with groups that are considered or affiliated with HTS, mostly the Syrian National Army. And while the rest of Syria is still sort of celebrating and enjoying, the fighting is still happening between those two forces. So including them in the sort of the process and trying to reach an agreement will be crucial for not only reuniting the different territories of the country, but also moving beyond stabilizing it and hopefully reaching a sort of peaceful settlement. Now, then you talk about link it directly to the groups they're fighting. The Syrian National Army, they are mainly based in northwestern Syria, and mostly they border the northeast and the areas they and the groups they're fighting there. Now they are mostly backed by Turkey, and they have strong relationship with Turkey. In addition to them, you have different groups that participated directly with HTS in their fight against the regime during the offensive you mentioned. You have some of them who were remnants of the Free Syrian Army before. You have others, more Islamist sort of groups that have more of an Islamist sort of identity, like al-Sham. And then if we then talk about moving to southern Syria, you have the groups that are based in Daraa, and you have different groups there, but the biggest one is led by Ahmad al-Audi, and it's basically under al-Liwa al-Samin. And then you have in Suwaida different also armed groups that are mostly local led, and they mostly linked to the local population of Suwaida, which is a Druze majority area. You have 10th forces there, mostly supported by the US, and their number is not that big. You have foreign fighters also in Idlib, and in addition to all of those, you have the former regime forces. We're talking about militias, we're talking about official military factions, but also we're talking about security forces. So this is in brief that those are the different actors. Now, when we talk about the number and forces and their current sort of relationship with one another, you have groups that go to as high as 100,000 fighters, and those are the Syrian Democratic Forces. And then you have smaller groups that could be limited to a few hundred fighters, like those who are in southern Syria, especially in Suwaida. When it comes to the relationship with HTS, most of those groups, if not all, they had basically, they either fought against the group in the past, or they did not have a good relationship with HTS, which will be relevant when we talk about the next step. Now, moving to political actors, you have two main political actors, at least the official opposition that is recognized internationally. You have the Tilaf, which is the Syrian opposition coalition of opposition groups, and then you have the High Negotiation Commission, which has been leading the up until recently negotiations for a political settlement with the Syrian regime. Now, the last bit I want to end with, I know I'm running out of time, is that there has been, at least between HTS, which is currently leading the transition in Syria, there has been meetings and discussions with most of the armed groups, if not all of them, apart from former regime forces, in order to merge them together under one umbrella. And the meetings, some of them were, at least publicly, they were saying that they were positive. Others, there were crucial sort of differences. The same applies to political parties. There were meetings between them and the HTS, but in general, they did not reach really any agreement. And if we want to break it down to what are the main sort of challenges to unifying those armed as well as political groups, it comes down to two major issues. The first one is the nature of integrating or co-opting those groups, whether are armed or political. And here, HTS has been insisting on only inviting individuals, not groups, to be part of the transition. And the groups, whether those are political or even armed groups, they are insisting on joining as groups. And that's a major issue that has not been resolved yet. The other issue is related to the sequencing of integrating them. Now, most of the armed groups are insisting that they will only hand over their arms when there is an agreement and when there is an official, recognized, legitimate, not only government, but also army. And this has been the case, and that was at least publicly presented by different groups, which is which opposes what HTS has been saying, that the weapons should be immediately handed over, and then they should be then talking about the decision of or negotiating the details of how to integrate them, which positions they can talk about, and then restructuring the different armed as well as security forces. So those are the two major issues. We can talk about them later, but I think they will continue to be unresolved for a long time. Over to you.
Thank you, Hei'at. We will follow up on that with Marwan's contribution. Thank you for helping us unpack the actor map. It's quite complicated, and there are a lot of unknowns. And thanks for addressing certain aspects of their relations with the transition government. Now let's turn to Marwan Kabalan to explore the governance implications of these diverse players from where Hei'at left. So Marwan, Syria's stability depends on more than security, governance, elections, or a constitution. It really requires trust in individuals, groups, actors, figures into a sustainable framework. And as Hei'at suggested, as we know, there are plans for unified security structures. There are plans for state building and constitution making. But according to you, how realistic are these goals in Syria's fragmented landscape, and what is the potential for Syria's diverse actors to align under a national framework? Please tell us what you think about this, maybe from both looking at the internal conditions that are necessary for stability and democracy, and also external influences that could either support or deepen divisions among these groups. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ozok, and thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me to this timely event. As everybody today is interested in what's going on in Syria, in understanding what's going on in Syria, although it's not that easy task actually to have. Indeed, I mean, the old regime has collapsed, but the new one is yet to emerge. I believe right now the Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham, the new administration, is completely consumed with two major issues. The first one is providing security. This is the main issue right now. And by that, I mean also to disarm the major armed factions, dissolve them and integrate them in a centralized army. In addition to that, they are working to improve the living standard of Syrians. As you know, I mean, the economic situation in Syria is extremely bad, given the past 14 years of conflict in the country, in addition to the sanctions and the poor administration of the previous regime. But Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham and the new administration, they discovered soon actually that they cannot go far in providing either security and convincing the armed factions to disarm and join the centralized army, or improve the living standards of Syrians without actually establishing some sort of a political framework, i.e. political process. Because as Hei'at has mentioned, some of the armed factions actually, they are reluctant to disarm and join the army unless they know what their role is going to be in the future of Syria. That was very clear by the statement made by the Druze religious leader Hikmet al-Hajri, for example, when he said that we are not going to disarm unless we have a constitution and we know what role we have actually in a new Syria. That is also the position of other factions. SDF also is reluctant to disarm unless they know what sort of role the Kurds will play in the future of the country. So this actually is putting huge pressure on Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham and the new administration in order to come with a political framework, with a political process that makes everybody believe he is going to have a role in new Syria, in future Syria. The living standard of Syrians also needs this sort of political process, because as we have all seen from the visits of foreign dignitaries to Damascus in recent weeks, that all of them actually are insisting on starting some sort of inclusive political process that would encompass all of the Syrian forces before the sanctions can be lifted, before any direct investment is going to be sent to Syria, and of course before any meaningful reconstruction process can start. So these two issues actually needs that political framework. We can see for sure that Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham and the new administration had made some progress in terms of rhetoric, because if you monitor their attitude at the very beginning, the very early days after the collapse of the Assad regime, there was no mention of interim transitional body or national dialogue conference. In recent weeks, actually over the past couple of weeks, we started to hear that they are actually willing to talk about interim transitional body that would include maybe civilian and military figures from the different political forces in Syria. And also they are talking about a conference of national dialogue that would encompass at least 1,200 Syrian political figures, but not, of course, political forces, parties, or political clans. Also, we have been hearing about that the conference of national dialogue would end up with establishing like a constitutional committee in order to draft a new constitution for the country. And that will be followed by elections, leading, of course, to the end of the transitional period by having the election for the parliament or the presidency, depending on the political system the Syrians will agree upon during writing or drafting the constitution. Of course, there are so many challenges that are facing these different tasks that we can talk about maybe later. But for now, this is what I see, the three major issues that are now consuming the new government: establishing security, providing for the basic needs for the Syrian people, and starting a political process, an inclusive political process, in order to be able to move. And these three tracks, actually, they have to move in parallel. They are so interconnected. You can't actually disconnect one from the other. You can't actually go far in any of these without the others also having progress in dealing with them.
Thank you very much, Marwan. Thank you for mentioning the three tracks: security, basic needs, and inclusive political structure, which are all interconnected. I would like to shift the focus to humanitarian aspect, maybe the two tracks that you have mentioned, like security, safety, basic needs of the people. So I would like to continue with Arva, who is and Arva's first-hand experience could bring us closer to the human cost of the conflict. The analysts, the think tanks, the media has been focusing a lot on geopolitics and political debate, political restructuring. But the real story lies in the lives disrupted, the children in refugee camps, families torn apart, and communities clinging to hope. And the human stories often fade into the background, but they are the very core of Syria's crisis. So Arva, is someone who have experienced, who has witnessed the humanitarian crisis firsthand, actually since during the civil war as well, through your work. Could you portray the situation on the ground in Syria from a humanitarian perspective? And what do you see as the key steps to restoring public confidence in a government after years of trauma, displacement, and devastation? And how do you think these issues should be successfully addressed for the transition process, for the transitional process, and as the political system is rebuilt?
Thank you. So there is obviously a deeply emotional human component to all of this that unfortunately does get extraordinarily sidelined when it comes to not just talking about conflict and policy and approach, but also when it comes to talking about the next day. And this is not something that is necessarily unique to Syria. Look, I am a former CNN senior international correspondent, and as such, I covered Syria on the ground extensively since 2011, and also remotely through the work of extraordinary activists. And as we look and talk about what Syria needs to do moving forward, there's a lot of talk about how Syria reconciles and what kind of an identity Syria wants to build for itself, because there is, despite all of the various divisions, general consensus that nobody wants to return to the identity that Syria had under, 50 years of brutal rule by the Assad regime's father and son. And as I think back on the last 13 years, and I really noticed this, I was in Syria at the end of December, is that underneath the kind of joy and the wow, can you believe the regime is gone reaction that is still quite prevalent to a certain degree, but sort of slowly diminishing, is people actually having to, right now, at this point in time, really come to terms with everything that has been lost just to be able to get here. The more than 500,000 dead, the more than 150,000 disappeared, the millions that were internally displaced time and time and time again, the millions that were made refugees. And on top of all of that, even within Syria itself, the certain level, and it ranges from, distrust to something that's a bit more subtle than that, in the sense that bridges need to be rebuilt between various different communities that exist to be able to actually form what can be a sort of social fabric. I mean, Syria is effectively right now trying to redesign, redefine its own social tapestry. And when we talk about the trauma of the past, no matter how old you are, whether you're a child or you're an adult, you're never going to fully heal from what it is that Syrians, or that a person as a Syrian, has actually gone through. When we talk about the need for humanitarian assistance, the need for psychological support, what we're talking about is giving an individual the tools to be able to move with the pain, to be able to soften the impact of the pain. And when you look at, and we went from Damascus to Homs to Aleppo, and we spent a lot of time actually in the Damascus suburb of Daraya, which for years was, besieged and bombed and starved, and, various reports of how at some points in time, people were basically boiling grass to make grass tea because that was all that they had. And when you go to Daraya, it is mostly destroyed. It is just carcasses of buildings. And a lot of the children there, and Daraya has roughly 15,000 of its men who have disappeared. A lot of the children would obviously regularly ask their mothers, where's daddy? And the mothers used to be able to respond, well, daddy's with the regime. Now the children are saying to them, but the regime is gone. So why isn't daddy home? And mothers don't know how to answer that. They don't know how to explain this to their children. Not to mention that, for years, a lot of mothers have had to play the role of both mother and father. When we talk about what children have been deprived of, and this to me was really quite jarring, and in some way I should have known better because I have so much experience in Syria, but it's the small details that kind of sometimes click something in your brain. So we were setting up this child-friendly space, and we put in, there's this like standard soft flooring that you put in. It's got all these different colors, and then, you toss a bunch of toys in there, and, normally kids are used to this, and they know that when they see the space and the flooring and the matting, that it's play space and it's fun time, and it's quite often, it's kid chaos. These children of Daraya had never seen a space like this in their life. And they were very timid at first when they came in, and extraordinarily polite, which was, so heartwarming to see. And it took a while for them to kind of grow into reacting like children again and realize, this is your space, this is your play space. And it's there where you really begin to realize the trauma of deprivation. And that's just only one aspect of trauma. If we look at another aspect of trauma, I constantly end up thinking back to this girl who I actually met in Idlib province. And this was a couple of years ago. She had lost one of her legs to a mine. Her father, years earlier, had been detained and disappeared in front of her. And we were chatting, and she wasn't talkative. She would just give me, one-word answers. And then at one point I asked her, do you dream of a life without war? And she kind of looked at me really blankly and shook her head. And then I asked her, well, do you even know what that looks like? And she shook her head. And so you have all of these various different levels of trauma and needs and humanity. We call them humanitarian concerns, and that kind of gives the impression that, oh, it's soft and it's secondary. But you cannot succeed in building a safe and stable state if you do not provide for your own people. And so humanitarian, concerns, whether it's access to food, to medicine, to education, mental health support, whatever aspect of it that falls under this, secondary soft category actually needs to be shifted and should be part of any sort of security and stabilization strategy.
Yeah. Arba, just a follow-up question very quickly, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Inara has opened an office in Damascus, so I was curious, how is the relationship between the transition government and local and international NGOs? Does it work smoothly?
So it's all a bit kind of messy at the moment. So you obviously have the internationals that were registered under the Assad regime. We were not, and at the moment we are actually working through local partners. And so we have not actually registered ourselves. We're working through local partners. Because here's the other thing also that, while a certain level of expertise is missing in Syria, and this is sort of part of the patchwork that Syria became. If you look at Idlib province, for example, there's actually a lot of, local experience in the humanitarian sector, which was quite robust to a certain degree in Idlib. That level of expertise, whether it's, psychological support or you name it, doesn't necessarily exist in Assad-controlled Syria. But there are organizations throughout the course of this time. And again, I'll go back to Daraya as an example. The local organization that we partnered with there for years was trying to provide for the population in Daraya, especially after they were permitted to return, albeit struggling greatly, constantly being, threatened by the mukhabarat, constantly being told, why are you helping the women and children of men who wanted to kill us? But they have an infrastructure in place. They have staff that have worked so hard for so long in place that why do we need to come in and sort of reinvent the wheel where we can go partner with these local organizations and boost up their own capacity? Ultimately, they know best. They live this. It's their country. It's their people. So I'm a big believer in kind of boosting what already exists as opposed to going in and starting from scratch. But broadly speaking, it is a bit messy right now, but that is to be expected in terms of regulations, expectations, and registrations.
Yeah, thank you, Arva, for bringing those human stories to the forefront. Now, finally, for the first round, let's turn to Hafsa to discuss how Syrians can take ownership of their future in the post-conflict era. I would like to ask you, Hafsa, to address this crucial question of who gets to write the next chapter for Syria beyond externally imposed narratives, given the risks associated with building a national narrative, given the challenges of state building and the challenges of the political processes, the humanitarian challenges. How do you think Syrians themselves become the author of their own story? As per your expertise in dialogue and track two processes, what inclusive methodologies would you recommend for building Syria's post-conflict context? And also, if we have time, obviously, it will be great to hear from you. How do we measure the success of Syria's transition as a result of these dialogue and diplomatic processes? Because everyone, like the West, has been putting benchmarks and criteria on Syria. Locals, communities will have expectations. Regional powers may come with their own interests. How are we gonna measure the success?
Thank you, Özge. And it's a pleasure to join my Syrian friends and colleagues, and very, very humbly joining you all as the non-Syrian to have this discussion, and just genuinely want to say, I mean, I've worked in civil society and I've worked across a number of different conflict theaters across the region, and I can genuinely say I don't think a situation has brought this much joy across the region amongst the people as seeing the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapse in December. And I will kind of humbly approach the question, of course, acknowledging that it is for Syrians to write their own history and their own trajectory, and to navigate the abundance of challenges. But you rightly point out that there are a significant number of interests at play and a significant number of people with a vested interest in particular outcomes in Syria. And for me, I think actually, and Hei'at and I have been discussing over the last few days with friends and within the civil society space, of the role of transitional justice in this wider transition as a truth mechanism, as a benchmark or a pillar to the identity of a post-Assad or a post-Ba'ath Syria, as well as the desperate need, I think, and to build on Arwa's incredibly powerful testimony on the need for Syrians themselves to have answers, not just over the last 13 years, but to have answers and to have some form of justice and accountability for the behavior of the regime over the last several decades. And so much of that is wrapped up in not just how this current administration, de facto administration, is messaging to Syrian people, but also the international community and how they respond to these calls for real active work on justice and accountability. There is a need to preserve the behavior, crime scenes as they've been called by civil society groups, but also to capitalize on the fact that for the last 12 to 13 years, the mass displacement, forced displacement of Syrians within and outside the country has mobilized an incredibly powerful amount of Syrian civilians within civil society seeking and planning and preparing for this moment. A lot of the civil society work that has gone into everything from the universal jurisdiction track, the transitional justice track, ICC, otherwise the French arrest warrant against Assad, etc., as well as the sort of domestic level transitional justice, has been stuff that has been planned and talked about and discussed for many, many years. And Syria, I think, I'm half Iraqi, so the Ba'ath regime is something of a legacy for my family as well. But I think genuinely you'd be hard pressed to find any country where every single family in one way or another has been affected by the brutality of a regime, the way that Syrians have been by the Assad regime. And part of writing that next chapter and writing their own story and their own future is going to be dependent on reconciling with the past. And that is going to come with acknowledging that there are not going to be answers to every single question. There is not going to be a straight line path of justice, be it criminal justice or transitional justice, reparations or otherwise, for every single crime that has been committed. There may still remain, sadly, and I hope that in years to come that is not the case, but there may still remain questions for certain families who never do find out the fate of their missing and formerly detained. And that is going to be really the bedrock, I think, of how Syria rebuilds itself. Just a quick note on foreign engagement or interest in Syria. I think it's too early to call it a foregone conclusion that the former alliances that shaped not just regime sustainability through the years of the war, but just generally the engagement with Syria, are completely turned on their head by the collapse of the regime. You know, there can be some very pragmatic approaches, not least economically and foreign policy wise, that continue to keep countries have a vested interest in new dispensations and new transitions, regardless of where ideologically their alliances may align. And I think, you know, for this region and for Syria specifically, that is a question that is very, very prominently being debated and discussed in Iraq and in Baghdad, as well as, of course, across the Gulf states where, to be fair, I think we're ranging even a month plus into this, into the events in Syria, ranging from sheer confusion and shock to now trying to get their ducks in a row. And all of this, of course, happening at a moment of great political change in Washington, which will either through inaction or through overtly negative activity or action, shall we say, in terms of the fact that this incoming administration is not going to look kindly on designated terrorist organizations seizing power, you know, this is a very, very, it's a moment of great flux, fluctuating political interests and investment, and there is no conventional policy to be applied specifically to Syria. We're going to see differing levels of engagement with different groups on the ground and different attempts to carve out control and influence, be it over small patches of territory or resources, or be it over the bigger political trajectory about the identity of Syria.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hafsa. Thanks for bringing the topic to regional and international actors, because we are starting the second round of questions looking mainly on regional and international implications of the Syrian revolution. So let's begin this round with Hei'at again. Hei'at, the West, how I mean the HTS transition government's relationship with the West raises a lot of questions, particularly as a religious grounded group undergoing transformation. We know and we heard from Arva also that much of this engagement with the West has developed in Idlib. What is your assessment of the transitional government positioning itself vis-a-vis the West and regional powers, but mostly the West? Let's focus on West, the Western world. And how do you think, how are Western powers approaching the Syrian transition? We know about the sanctions and conditionalities; they're very much discussed. Do you see a concrete or a developing, a promising Western policy towards Syria?
Thank you for the question. Starting with HTS and how it's trying to sort of approach the West. My PhD focused on HTS, and the main question I was trying to answer in that sort of thesis was why the group has been more successful than other rebel groups in Syria. And it comes down to one thing: pragmatism. And we are seeing exactly that when it comes to how the group is dealing with the West. You look at the promises, the statements made by the group, they are largely they align themselves with the asks that not only regional actors, but also international actors who are coming now to Damascus and who are making public statements about what they want to see in Syria. The statements made by the group reflect those demands and those asks. And in brief, what they're saying is that this is exactly what we're trying to do when it comes to inclusivity, when it comes to minority rights, when it comes to, without using the same sort of term, chart the sort of way for a different, more democratic future. Now, when it comes to how the West is responding to that, I think there is a lot of definitely distrust when it comes to believing what the group is saying, despite saying all the right things. For many reasons, as you mentioned, the group has a historical historical ties to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They also have the way they used to rule Idlib and other parts of Western Aleppo in that region was not exactly a role model that could be replicated elsewhere in terms of allowing local participation, in terms of the types of human rights violations against those who were perceived as their opponents. So this is why I think when the statements are now, in a way, trying to project a different image, that there is a lot of skepticism when it comes to believing what the group is saying. Regardless of that, and despite of that, I think what we have seen over the past weeks is that there is a genuine interest in engaging with the group, and maybe even going beyond that and giving the group a chance to prove itself, and then sort of support its statements with actions. And we have seen how they're going to Damascus, meeting al-Sharaa, but also they're going beyond that, and they're basically calling for the relief, or some of them even the lifting of sanctions, not only on Syria, but even some of them they're calling or lifting of sanctions on the group itself. But I think practically what we'll most likely see is that they will always be this sort of cautious approach to the group. Now, when it comes to what they are actually asking, unfortunately, most of them, they are making those sort of broad, general sort of demands about inclusivity, about protecting the rights of minorities. But it's difficult to really imagine a way in order to measure progress based on those general terms, and this will become one of the main challenges. Like, how can you measure inclusivity when it comes to the national, for example, dialogue, or whatever political process that comes after? And the other issue is might have more of a negative impact, is when you single out minorities and you talk about minorities' rights, instead of basically talking about rights of everyone in Syria, including minorities, without singling them out. And then later on, when you see that some groups are maybe being marginalized, or they're not giving their rights, then you can talk about different groups that are basically not having not able to practice their full citizenship like everyone else. And this is one of the bits that I think quite negative in the way they are portraying their demands, and they might even lead to this approach might even lead to a sort of counterproductive outcome by just making approaches that will tick boxes without really leading to any meaningful change when it comes to including those minorities, or including even women in the participation, rather than really sort of designing process that will allow for people to genuinely participate in contributing to making, materializing the vision they have for their country. I'll stop here. I'd be happy to talk about it more later.
Thank you. Thank you, Hei'at. So we can continue with Marwan to explore the regional implications of Syria's transition, focusing on non-Arab actors. Then I will like to follow with the regional Arab states with Hafsa. Marwan, how do you assess the current and future roles of non-Arab regional actors, specifically Iran, Turkey, and Israel? What are the ripple effects we might expect from Iran and Israel, especially including potential maneuvers and alliances, and how might Turkey leverage the decreasing influence of Iran while navigating the potential increase in Israel's territorial ambitions? Marwan, you're muted. You're on mute.
I was saying, actually, before addressing the issue of the regional actors, the non-Arab actors, I wanted actually to say something I forgot to mention in my previous intervention, that we shouldn't be expecting a functioning democracy in Syria anytime soon, because in the coming years, actually, I think the transitional government, Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham, will be busy actually re-establishing the state institutions And I don't want to look pessimistic here, actually, but I don't want also to underestimate the challenges. We still need to deal with two key questions, actually, in the coming months and years. The first one is the Alawite question in Syria, and the other one is the Kurdish question in Syria. Now we have like 300 to 400,000 Alawite who have lost their livelihood as a result of the collapse of the Assad regime. And unless we have some sort of a solution to that problem, actually, in order to get them integrated into the new system, I believe that we might be having another round of fighting in Syria, not long time from now. That would also apply to the Kurdish question. Of course, we have the other factions that we have talked about earlier, supported by regional players, Turkey, the United States, and also Israel. So we still have challenges, actually, that we have to deal with before talking about any meaningful the democratic process in Syria. But here, where the role of the international community becomes really essential, because we really need, in order to avoid anarchy and chaos in Syria, in order to avoid another round of fighting in Syria, that would have serious implications both for the region and worldwide. And the lifting of the sanctions should not be conditional upon anything in Syria. The international community must do everything possible right now in order to help the new administration in Damascus in order to deal with the challenges, both security and economic. Because if they fail, I believe the consequences will be dire, not only for Syrians, but for the whole region. Now I'll come to the question of Syria, of Syria's non-Arab neighbors, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. Of course, Iran was the biggest loser of the collapse of the Assad regime, because they invested a lot over the past 14 years in order to prevent the collapse of Assad, and they are still in a state of disbelief at the quick pace of which the regime has collapsed last month. Turkey is the biggest winner, perhaps, because they have been working really hard over the past years in order to bring Assad down, and Assad was brought down eventually. After everybody was actually believing that Assad has won, like a few weeks or a few months ago. For Israel, it's a mixed outcome here, because they are not sad to see Assad actually gone, but they are not happy with the replacement. They believe that they replaced Shiite extremists with Sunni extremists here. So they are not quite happy with that. But we should perhaps, and I believe that the competition in the coming months and years will be mainly between, it was between Turkey and Iran before, but now it's going to be perhaps between Israel and Turkey. And we should be focusing on the attitude of these two actors in the coming weeks and months. We're still actually monitoring the relationship between Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham and Turkey, because it's not as smooth as many people would like to think. And one indication of that, despite there is a visit today by the new foreign minister of Syria to Turkey, but we still think that maybe Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham is trying actually to have like a more independent policies than Turkey would like, actually, or would tolerate. And one indication about the position of Turkey is we still don't know why the transitional government of the opposition, the political opposition, and I'm talking here about the government of the Syrian National Coalition, why it's still there, why it hasn't been dissolved so far, why the coalition itself is still not dissolved, why the negotiation commission is still there. And these are questions actually are also asked by the new government in Damascus during the meeting between Ahmad al-Sharaa and Hadi al-Bahra and Badr Jamous last week. The main discussion actually was about these issues. What are you still doing, you guys, here? Because you are supposed actually to dissolve We are having now the regime has gone. We have a new government in Damascus. So I don't know if Turkey will at one point using them as a tool to put some pressure on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in order to come to terms with what Turkey actually is demanding. We still need to see that in the future. As far as Israel is concerned, Israel is also watching closely the situation in Syria, and we have seen over the past few weeks the Israeli incursion inside Syrian territories. They have already occupied something like 600 square kilometers of Syrian territories that include the demilitarized zone, the 400 square kilometers of the demilitarized zone, plus 200 square kilometers of new Syrian territories are occupied now by Israel. And we think now that there are some connections between both the SDF and the Israelis, and also some factions in Suwaida and Israel. So the regional actually context is also fluid, as we can see it right now, and that is going to impact hugely the situation in Syria. This is why when I meant that we shouldn't be underestimating the challenges that we are going to face in the coming weeks and months, and don't get deceived by the apparent tranquility that we are seeing right now in Syria, because things could deteriorate fast again, depending on also the attitude of the Trump administration. What sort of policy the Trump administration, this is a very important question that maybe we need to address at one point, that what sort of policy we are going to have with the new Trump administration. The US still has something like 2,000 troops in the northeast of the country. Will Trump withdraw them, or will he actually keep them? What is going to be his position vis-a-vis the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham government in Damascus? So far, he has been giving positive signals towards Turkey. Some people believe that he might be using Turkey as a subcontractor in Syria. But what about Israel, his major ally also in the country? Will there be a conflict of interest here between those who are supporting Turkey and those who are supporting Israel within the Trump administration? I mean, these are still open questions, actually. We still have to wait and see. And I will stop here. Maybe, I mean, at a later point, we can come back to some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Marwan. Indeed, I mean, we don't have answers to many of the questions that you posed in this regard. We have, because of the time limits, I will quickly turn to Hafsa. Hafsa, could you elaborate on how has Syria affected the positions and interests of the regional or neighboring Arab states, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, and the Gulf countries? And how might they shape Syria's trajectory going forward? How might they influence what comes next? What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Özgen. And I want to be brief because I think it's important to hear from colleagues. I mean, to be quite frank, I don't think anyone really can identify very specifically, outside of the ideological, traditional kind of, anti-Islamist countries, so to speak, Egypt, the UAE, Jordan to a large extent. But even having said that, I think there is a lot of room for new types of engagement, because ultimately, even for the sort of more ideologically Islamist aligned militarized groups, non-state actors that we've seen across the region for many years, there is a shift. I mean, the ideology might attract recruitment, but ultimately they seek power through territory, resources, control, having control over money, and they may enable proxy sponsors based on these kinds of opportunities that they will provide them in different countries. So it's not a black and white picture. What we can say, however, and that is sort of born out of, I think, the the more dominant Gulf foreign policy, Gulf states foreign policy in the last 5 or 6 years in the region is that we are going to see a very transactional nature of politics in engaging with Damascus. And here I just want to point out that one of our weaker points is not really acknowledging the capacity question of Hei'at Tahrir al-Sham and HTS generally across the entire country. And beyond just the areas where there are still armed groups or there are armed groups that dominate or control certain parts of the country, this is a country that for 14 years of conflict was not partitioned, but was very much divided. What that means is that power is not going to simply be a case of replacing a centralized regime in Damascus led by the Assad regime with another dispensation that governs from Damascus. There are now constituencies, decentralized centers of power that will have a very large say in the trajectory of the country and how it's governed. And that, I think, building on Hayat's points, creates different questions for us to address in regularly addressing the HTS progression and how HTS is responding to all these different demands. Very quickly, just to say that I think the transactional debate is going to spread across the non-Arab powers and the Arab powers. The question of the Jolani and how that plays into the US and Israel and their different levels of possible acceptance of HTS, or at least non-engagement with HTS, if not deliberately openly attacking them. How the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq engages with its Iraqi counterparts in Baghdad, but also with Damascus, is going to possibly have greater influence over the question of SDF and the the sort of possible autonomy question about northeastern Syria, and so on and so forth. For the Gulf countries, ultimately, we are in a moment built by, or born out of, I should say, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where the broader de-escalation agenda with the non-Arab powers in the region has been substantially suspended temporarily, particularly when it comes to Israel. And what we're now concerned with, and what they are primarily concerned with, is GCC regional security, national security, which, as Marwan rightly pointed out, is defined by this bigger Israel-Iran confrontation that has been stop-starting for a while and could very much be ramped up with the Trump administration. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Hafsa. Finally, let's shift to Arva Damon to explore how humanitarian needs and development goals intersect in Syria's transition. We have, most of our speakers have mentioned the international actors, development goals, contractors, subcontractors, and the needs and necessities in Syria, but we know that development is not just about rebuilding infrastructure, it's about restoring dignity, opportunity, hope of the people. So, Arva, can you share your insights on how immediate humanitarian needs can be balanced with long-term development goals, and what role should Western, US or European, Middle Eastern, Global South actors play, and what should be the division of responsibilities among development agencies, especially international ones, and what and their terms of engagement with the Syrian government, local organizations, and communities in Syria should be.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it was quite interesting because when, the news broke that, Damascus had fallen and that the Assad regime was gone, I was actually coincidentally with a group of Syrians who were very sort of politically active. And right along that time, I think, Trump tweeted that the US should sort of stay out of it. And their reaction to that was, yes, thank you, stay out. And there needs to be a recognition of the level of experience and expertise that Syrians themselves have gained over the last 13 years. And an appreciation of what it is, and also an appreciation of what civil society in Syria itself can also achieve on its own. So when we talk about, what foreign actors should be doing when it comes to how to support Syria and how to allow for Syria to be able to move forward, I find it very straightforward. Foreign actors should not allow their own political objectives to hinder and or define how it is that they act and interact with the various different elements that, make up Syria's current patchwork of, be it military or political or security entities. That is obviously not going to happen because unfortunately that is not the sort of multi-dimensional geopolitical chess world that we live in. But the more outside interference there is in Syria, the less likely it is that Syria is actually going to have a chance to succeed. There have been some very interesting conversations that have been taking place between Syrians who kind of lived all of this mostly on the outside and were kind of considered to be sort of the outside Syria opposition versus those that actually lived it on the ground. And in these spaces that they've been trying to engage each other in, because there does need to be a rebuilding of these very vital, bridges between these various different, elements of what a Syrian's experience has been with the last 13 years, with the last 50 years, has been that some of these key issues that need to be addressed, Syrians inside Syria have been saying to other groups like, look, let us handle this part of it. When it comes to education and the changes that, we're hearing that are going to be made to kind of educational curriculums and, women's rights and all, they're saying, let us handle this. Like, we know how to mobilize ourselves. We know how to handle this. Let this stay with us. There's also another very sad reality, and that is that, if we look at history, a lot of the time at this critical juncture in sort of a nation's evolution, sadly, there is a second round of fighting. But that second round of fighting, the sort of breaking into another form or shape of civil war, cannot and does not happen unless outside factors, outside countries themselves are supporting the various warring parties. So part of the conversation also needs to be, when we look at all of this, whether it's, Turkey, the United States, some of the other Gulf countries and the various different factions that they themselves are supporting, is how can they be lobbied? What pressure points can be put onto them so that they also kind of back off and say, look, like, now is the time for you all to start moving forward together. And when it comes to, the humanitarian space, look, you cannot have security in a country if people are hungry, if people are unable to access, medical care. And let me just give you a very basic, quick example when it comes to Syria. And as I was saying, Syrian society, very active, online, very good at mobilizing itself. But you can't do that if you don't have electricity and you can't charge your cell phone and you don't have proper cell phone networks. So it's that very basic thing of, the right to electricity, which is in constant shortages all across Syria right now. There are some of the sort of quick things that, could be fixed, but are kind of facing a lot of challenges just in trying to sort that out because of the sanctions and a number of other factors that exist, to allow sort of civil society itself, Syrians themselves, to start defining some of these spaces and what they want it to be, as opposed to having to constantly kowtow to outside forces.
Yes, thank you, Arva. I think you finished with some really strong notes and messages. I would like to, we have covered a lot of ground, and it's time to turn to questions. We have a lot of questions, a lot of thoughtful ones listed here, but because we don't have enough time to address all of them, and some of them, actually most of them, have been addressed by the speakers in one way or another. I will choose the ones that are related to the Gulf, to Qatar, and to the region. Let me start with this one. The first question in the Q&A. I will read these questions and give you the floor one by one, maybe in reverse order this time, or in a mixed order. So please feel free to respond, give your responses based on your expertise and based on your wish. So the first question comes from an anonymous attendee. What role could Qatar play in building this new Syria, considering the incoming Trump administration's critical stance on Qatar's support for Islamists in the past, alongside Qatar's efforts to maintain good relations with Iran and navigate Saudi Arabia's ambitions in Syria? We have a similar question submitted through the online form. How might regional rivalries, particularly between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, affect their willingness to invest in Syria's recovery? How can Syria balance its alliances with Iran and other regional powers while avoiding exacerbating tensions with Israel? This is one of the questions, and for rivalry and competition themed questions, we have another one which was translated into the English for me from Arabic. Is there compatibility between the Turkish and Saudi positions on Syria, and where do they converge and where do they differ? I will take these three questions for the time being and turn to Marwan.
Yes. Yeah, as far as Qatar is
Quickly,
concerned,
please.
you know, Qatar has been has played a very active role during the Syrian conflict. At the very early years, actually, they supported the Syrian opposition in all means possible. And now I believe Qatar and other countries should play exactly the same role. We need them. We need all these actors actually to play a very active role now in rebuilding the country, because we have been telling them that you guys, you contributed actually somehow to destroying Syria. So now it's your turn actually to try to rebuild it. So and this is what they are trying to do right now. The Qataris are playing now, as I said, I mean, a very active role. They have established a bridge between Doha and Damascus in order to provide all sort of humanitarian aid to the Syrian people. But as Arwa has said previously, and I think I can't agree more with Arwa. She put it very eloquently that if the international community doesn't provide all the sort of support to Syria right now, and if the regional actors do not cease actually to support different actors in terms of that might lead actually to a new round of conflict, we are not going to have a stable Syria. And as I said before, instability in Syria will have a great impact at the region and the world. We all know that in 2015, Europe thought that the Syrian crisis can be isolated, can be kept inside Syria, but then they discovered the hard way that it won't actually, and they received in 2015 more than 1 million Syrian refugees. Plus, of course, we have seen the rise of ISIS in Syria. So if we are gonna have exactly the same symptoms, so let's actually stand idle and watching Syria perhaps disintegrate further and fail actually to get stable as we all wish. The one question that I would like also to quickly, I mean, to touch upon is that the interest of Saudi Arabia and Turkey in Syria. Mm-hmm. The two countries right now they have their mutual interest actually to stabilize Syria. The two countries their mutual interest was actually to get Iran out of Syria, and they did, in fact. But they are mainly the divergence between them actually is Saudi Arabia is concerned about the ideological tendencies of the new regime in Damascus. They don't want to see an Islamist regime in Syria because, as we have seen over the past few years, actually, Saudi Arabia was very much against, and even when the Saudis decided actually to restore relations with Bashar al-Assad, one reason was to prevent an Islamist takeover in Damascus. They couldn't prevent that. So the Saudis also are pragmatic. So they are actually trying to take advantage now and not actually to make the same mistake in Iraq when they left Iran alone, actually. dominating the country. Now they jump into the fray, and they are competing with other actors in Syria in order to have their share of influence in this very important and strategically located country.
Thank you. Hafsa, can we continue with you?
I think Arwa put her hand up. It's just a very quick comment to say, you know, particularly as people who are policy experts in this space, obviously these kinds of roles and relationships and the different interests are very, very important. But I just want to sort of shout out, but also to say that even just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, Syrians in Syria across different parts have already done a pretty interesting and are already establishing an interesting ability to hold the current de facto temporary administration in Damascus accountable on a number of issues. And they're asking questions and they're demanding responses. And we do get caught in a bit of a trap of a self-fulfilling prophecy or confirmation bias based on where we sit in the region and the kind of alliances and policies that we expect to see from the countries. But this happened so quickly in terms of the actual removal of Bashar al-Assad. And I think that there is a lot of cases of countries even debating within themselves what their approach is going to be based on how, you know, and we've had some surprising shifts, or not surprising shifts, but, you know, the de facto foreign minister of Syria's first trip was to Riyadh, not to Ankara, not to any of these other places. He went to Riyadh, then he went to Doha, then he went to Abu Dhabi. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is a trilateral Gulf alliance that is working together to support this. So we can't just, you know, already at this point grasp at this. And I think there's a real opportunity to look at what Syrian civil society that's returning, that's already active, that's on the ground, is demanding of HTS. And by that measure, look at how the countries respond to those kinds of demands and needs and see the kind of trajectory that we might put Syria on that is different from, and not to be too idealistic, but I genuinely have real hope for Syria's transition, that it doesn't turn out the way other post-2011 transitions have gone.
Thank you. Arvo?
Yeah, just to add briefly on to, you know, what has been said, there's also, you know, the very real challenge that the interim government faces of where is it going to get money to keep paying employees, to keep paying salaries. And part of the concern, especially among Gulf nations, is can they support this and somehow bypass the US sanctions that are not, you know, obviously anywhere near close to be lifted. And so what, you know, some observers are warning is that if there is not a way to economically bolster, i.e. get cash to this interim government, who is going to realistically step in to fill that void? The Russians will step in to fill that void. The Iranians may or may not be able to step in to fill that void. But ultimately, and again, I'm loath to have this conversation of like how outside players are going to be getting their own piece of the Syrian pie. But logically speaking, that is a big conversation that needs to be had, because a key aspect of HTS being able to establish, you know, its legitimacy, the legitimacy of the interim government, is because it doesn't have enough of its own sort of fighters or politicians or whatever, is it's going to need to engage. It's going to need to hire. It's going to need to pay salaries, because bottom line, people want to eat and they want to feed their families. And so there isn't kind of this luxury of time where, you know, various different governments can sit around and debate X, Y, or Z if they actually want to give this process a chance to be able to succeed. And again, it also ultimately has to be on Syrians' terms.
Thank you very much. Hei'at, final remarks, please.
Sure. I'll keep it short because we're running out of time. But I think in general, what we have seen, at least over the past couple of weeks, is that regional and international actors have been coordinating more than before when it comes to the messages they have, when it comes to the vision they have with regard to Syria. And I think if they continue working together and pushing for those common objectives that they don't only share among themselves, but shared by Syrians as well, will be sort of the right way to do it. The wrong way to do it will be for each one to start basically establishing this transactional relationship with HTS in order to allow them to consolidate their power, and then which will potentially push the country in the wrong direction and destabilize not Syria, but the region as well. So those are the two options. And I think for now, they're heading in the right direction. And I hope that they will continue doing so. Over.
Thank you very much. Great messages, great notes to follow up on. So thank you all for being part of this concise but rich and engaging conversation. Your insights and perspectives have been invaluable. The webinar will be posted on ME Council's YouTube channel later. As closing remarks, I would like to say, if a friend who recently visited Syria, who has recently come back, said it feels like a wedding in a house of mourning, where joy and celebration seem misplaced in the hard context of sorrow and tragedy. And indeed, this contrast is striking, and I could feel that in your contributions as well as firsthand witnesses of the transition. So it's actually, it's for academia, for civil society, for think tanks. This also represents an extraordinary state-building experiment to watch and to contribute. And we are grateful for the great analysts, experts, and practitioners who are closely following developments in Syria. At the Council, we will also be leading some of these important discussions, debates in the coming days. And let's stay connected. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.